Good morning. Dave Sobel here from the Business of Tech podcast. I am live streaming to talk out 4 stories I didn't cover on the podcast, but I really wanted to, so I want to actually present them here. For those that are not familiar, the Business of Tech is a daily 5-minute podcast that I do covering technology stories through the lens of somebody delivering IT services. The idea being that if you deliver technology services, your perspective may be slightly different and you want to understand why these stories matter. So I cover the stories and then I additionally give some insight into why I think they matter. Podcast is available on all of your favorite podcatchers. It's available on YouTube and available as an Amazon skill to your Alexa-enabled devices. With that gives you a little bit of sense of what it's doing. I then do live streams on YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, Twitch, all simulcast so that you can get it on your streaming location of choice. And then these videos and live streams are made available. So with that, appreciate your attention. Let's dive in for a bit of discussion. I will be keeping an eye on the chat, so if you've got questions or thoughts as we go in, hit me up. You can additionally find me on social media as well afterward, and I do keep an eye on the comments of these when they become videos. So with that, let's dive in to some of our stories. Wanted to start with actually a pair that I was intrigued by. I didn't actually find time to get them into the podcast, but that doesn't mean I didn't want to talk about them because I thought they were pretty interesting. A bill is moving through Congress intended for the Department of Homeland Security to fund coordinators for each state who would be focused on cybersecurity. And I thought this was pretty interesting because this is one of those areas where if we're actually having much more local coverage of cybersecurity and much more involvement from local government by having people embedded at the state level, this really kind of spoke to me. This related back to a story that I covered about 3 weeks ago or so, about when the city of New Orleans actually initiated their emergency procedures and declared a state of emergency when a ransomware happened. By actually having local state coordinators, this would actually kind of make that process a little bit different. The state coordinators had specific tasking here. They would serve as the risk advisor and coordinate efforts between the state and the Fed at this level. Of course, they'd have an awareness element of that to the resources that are available from the federal government at the state level that were needed. They'd have a training element to them, being able to make sure that they were planning for those kinds of issues that might happen. And additionally, they'd help in what they call non-federal entities. And this all really struck me as, okay, this is really interesting because besides the fact that it accesses and has a governmental resource that leverages that, those last 2 bits speak to me in terms of, hey, there's going to be consulting and services opportunities here to do it. I've included 2 different links to it. It was also covered over on MSSP Alert. Same kind of idea. And again, they're focused on, in particular, the lead was that quote around ransomware attacks that can block access to school and medical records, or cyber attacks shutting down grids and banking services. Again, I'm super interested in this because I think there's a ton of consulting opportunities, and if DHS is getting involved to have state coordinators, that pushes it down at a local level in a way that I get really intrigued by. So I wanted to highlight that story. Next up, Apple lawsuit tests if an employee can plan a rival startup on the payroll. This jumped out at me because I love talking about employment laws and the way company culture matters to somebody. The story, here's the way it goes. A former chip executive started a competitive company, and he started obviously thinking about it at some level during his time at Apple. At that point, he then moved on, started a competing company engineering those kinds of chips, and off to the races. Apple is now suing, saying that you can't do that. You can't. You started it on company time. this is going to really tell us a lot about the way the law is going to be written for the way you build startups, the way that companies get created from ideas and get taken out. What's interesting to me is this is, we talk about this being a time of massive innovation. There's actually less companies being started now than in previous decades. There's a lot of data tracking on this, and so for me, this idea of like, how will this lawsuit progress to give us insight into how you can start up your own companies, that really did jumped out. That was why the story was of interest to me, and obviously just didn't have time to cover it on the podcast. So I wanted to get it out here on the live stream. Additionally, let's talk about some changes and some announcements from research on the average ransomware extortion. So we've got a number. It's $84,000 according to the research. Average ransom payments Q4 of 2019 increased by 104%, up to $84,116, up from $41,198 in Q3 2019. Median payment $41,000. So you got a new number to quote to your customers about how this kind of stuff costs. Now, that's the ransomware. I also want to contrast this with a story that I did last week on the podcast, and I'll be releasing as a video to highlight it as well, in terms of the lawsuit that's happening against an Ohio MSP service provider for breach of contract who actually fell victim to a phishing attack. That lawsuit in the $1.7 million range. Now, competing technologies we're talking about here, we're talking about ransomware. There, it's a phishing attack and how much that ended up costing, and then the lawsuit on top of that. But I think it's interesting to look at this when the amount of money to pay the ransom is way less than the lawsuit. This makes some sense. We talked about this on Killing It based on a listener question about what our thinking was on paying ransomware. When you throw the numbers out here, it actually makes some sense. You get a sense of why people might pay the ransom rather than fall victim to it, because this is cheaper. It's actually cheaper to deal with the mistake in this mechanism than it is to fight it at some level, or to get caught with it and not deal with it, because the lawsuit can maybe a whole lot more. So that really kind of jumped out at me there, saying that, hey, here's a number, but the contrast between the differences, that's the last bit. Finally, fourth story that intrigued me this week is the UK. This is Brexit Eve. The UK leaves the EU tomorrow at 2300 GMT. And one of the stories that came out is that the contentious digital copyright law will not follow. This is kind of interesting to me that, the level of oversight that the EU was putting in place here required that all sites check all uploaded content for copyrighted material. It had softened a little bit in terms of quoting, reviewing, but the UK is not going to hold on to this particular portion of it. It doesn't necessarily mean, as the article says, that this is going to be a looser approach in the UK, but it does tell us a little bit about the way the government is thinking. Obviously, governments change over time. The UK did just have an election, so I think it's fair to say they've probably got 4 to 5 years of this current government. So that'll give us some kind of indication of the way that's looking. Those are my 4 stories. They jumped out at me this week, and I wanted to cover them. Obviously, when you have a 5-minute podcast, you don't get the chance to cover all of those stories. So I appreciate people's feedback. What do you think of the different stories? What am I saying here that's making a difference? Did you get something that helped out of this? I'm also thinking about including these kind of live streams as bonus content to let people know on the weekends that they can catch up on some of these stories in a more casual, loose perspective. So I may try that with this coming weekend. So So thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, subscribe in all of the various places. Here's how you can get content from MSP Radio. You can go to mspradio.com. We have a weekly newsletter that gives you a written version of some of the stories so that you can catch up written in that way. Sign up for the newsletter there. Of course, the podcast itself is The Business of Tech. It is available on all of the major podcatchers. You can catch it online anywhere that podcasts are broadcast with subscribe links, again, at mspradio.com. These live streams come out as videos. We do put all of the videos on the YouTube channel, which you can find, again, a link in the website. But you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, get access to all of the live streams, get all of the recorded videos, and even have the opportunity to listen to the podcast there if you are so inclined. The videos are also put on Facebook for streaming perspective, as well as places like Twitch, if you are interested. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. Thank you for listening. Look forward to ongoing conversations and your feedback. Thank you, and have a great day.